The Gospel and its importance. My name is Martin Whittock. I am a historian, columnist and political and religious commentator with a particular interest in the impact of faith on modern life and the way that the past informs the present. I taught history at UK Comprehensives for 35 years and I'm also a lay minister in the Church of England. I write adult history books for the general reader and have written a number of history school textbooks too. In both my personal and my professional life, issues of evidence, reliability, and how we understand the complexity of life are big deals. I think they're big deals for everyone. And that brings me to the Gospel and its importance. But first, a brief explanation of this word. It's an Old English word. That is a word that an Anglo-Saxon would have recognised. In Old English, it is Godspell. This is made up of two words, God, good, and spell, news. So gospel is literally good news. It's a translation of the Greek word evangelion, which means, no surprise this, good news. It's the word from which we get the term evangelical. So gospel and evangelical are the same words in different languages, and both simply mean good news. At the time of Jesus and the first generation of Christians, it was not a religious term. For example, in 9 BC, an official Roman text, a piece of imperial political propaganda called the Prian inscription reads, referring to the first emperor Augustus, Augustus was the beginning of the good news, evangelion, for the world. Interestingly, the same inscription also describes Augustus as Saviour. Now, we understandably find it rather shocking to hear someone like Augustus described like that. This is because we find it hard to hear these words without a religious meaning. But originally, evangelion, gospel, was just a phrase that was used all over the place to describe anything that someone thought was, well, good news. And saviour was used to describe someone who, to put it bluntly, got you out of a mess. Today, evangelical, gospel, is used to describe brands of churches, particular outlooks and groups of people, as in, is this a gospel evangelical church? How will US evangelicals vote in the presidential election? What do evangelicals think about this? Are you a preacher who preaches the gospel? We kind of know what is in a tin with this label. It implies belief in the Bible as authoritative, belief in historic Christian ideas as expressed in the creeds, maybe a particular style of community, perhaps a particular kind of worship. But the reality is that it should not really be seen as a label of one type of Christian or a type of church. This is because Christianity is evangelical, is gospel, is good news. One cannot remove that from it and still think it's Christianity. We might have all kinds of disagreements, but what we should all agree on is this. The Christian message is good news. It is gospel. That is why when the early followers of Jesus wrote down his message and actions, their accounts came to be known in English as the Gospels, according to Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. In other words, here is the good news about Jesus as recorded by Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. In fact, Mark actually starts his account with the words, the beginning of the good news, evangelion, about Jesus the Messiah, in Greek, Christ, the Son of God. Gospel is not a bolt-on or a personal preference. It is what it's all about. Listen, say the gospel writers, I have good news. The Roman emperor thinks he's the saviour and does stuff that is good news, but I'm telling you that if you really want your life sorted out, you need Jesus. He's the real saviour, and if you want to hear the good news, then read on about Jesus. This is why the gospel is so important, because it's about Jesus, his status, nature, impact, importance. While we use it to describe 4 particular books in what became the New Testament, gospel is the message because it is about the God-man Jesus. He and what he did and does is good news. In fact, it is the best news. It's rooted in the idea that humans and the whole world, for all the beauty, nobility and amazingness, is flawed, out of relationship with God and often with each other. Unable to restore that relationship with God, is desperately in need of forgiveness and restoration. Enter Jesus. The New Testament insists that in this man, God's nature, power and authority was revealed in a unique way, and that Jesus is the remedy for the brokenness of humanity and the world. Now, I know the next talk is going to go into greater depth on explaining the gospel, but I had to touch on this to highlight why it is so important. The gospel is important because it insists there is good news that outweighs all other good news. It is life transforming. As a historian, I am convinced that what we have in the New Testament record is the persuasive and authoritative account of an earthquake that happened to a group of people in the 1st century AD, and that earthquake was the birth, life, death, resurrection and ascension of Jesus. A few years ago, I co-wrote a book entitled Jesus, the Unauthorized Biography. The aim was to explore what the New Testament says about Jesus and explain things that are not explained there, because the writers had more pressing things on their agendas. By the end of writing it, I was more convinced than ever that what was described was set in a realistic and believable context, was urgent and sincerely believed by those who wrote it, was consistent in its core message while accepting that different New Testament writers presented their material in particular ways in order to make the points they felt called to make, and was available in consistent manuscripts that survived from astonishingly close to the events they claimed to describe. On that last point, it really must be stressed how important this is. Records of other ancient people and events, concerning which nobody doubts their historicity, are separated from the people and events described by hundreds of years. What this means is that when we study someone like Julius Caesar or Emperor Augustus, we use literary sources whose earliest surviving manuscripts date from centuries after the person or events concerned. This is just not the case regarding the New Testament Gospels, and the other writings too. For them, the manuscript evidence is astonishingly strong. The New Testament Gospels abound in details concerning the life, movements and experiences of Jesus and date from very close to his lifetime. They claim to be eyewitness reports, or at least closely associated with eyewitnesses. And the time proximity of their compilation to the events described is striking. From a historian's point of view, it's actually a great strength that there are 4 of them. This gives us different perspectives on events while recognising that all 4 share certain core beliefs about Jesus and his impact. It also means that we have a broad base of evidence. We're not just dependent on one definitive document which has been edited in order to create one official and acceptable version. What is sometimes claimed to be a weakness for Gospels, which at times offer differing versions of events, is in fact a substantial strength. And the sheer number of surviving early manuscripts of the 4 Gospels is remarkable, as is their high level of agreement with each other. One should also note the rapidity with which the 4 canonical Gospels were accepted as authoritative within the early Christian communities. Also, it should be remembered that this was a time before Christianity commanded state power to impose orthodoxy. There is strong evidence from the writings of early church leaders that all 4 Gospels were accepted across most church communities by about the year 180. The so-called Muratorian fragment suggests that the basic New Testament canon was in place by the year 200. That is not, of course, the date of its writing, but rather of the acceptance of a collection of long-established documents constituting what we now call the New Testament, and the exclusion of other documents which were regarded as lacking authoritative connections to the first generations of believers. With regard to actual manuscripts, there survive some 5,300 in Greek, with very high levels of textual agreement, and 10,000 manuscripts survive in Latin, Syriac, Coptic, etc. Famously, the John Rylands manuscript P52 of the Gospel of John has been dated to as early as 100 to 150 AD. The Chester Beatty manuscript, containing many of the letters, dates from about 200 AD. Other fragments of manuscripts are even earlier. Almost all of the New Testament is present in surviving manuscripts compiled before the year 300. Soon after this date, complete parchment manuscripts survive, containing virtually the whole New Testament. And this is all prior to the Church possessing coercive state power sufficient to enforce uniformity. That's remarkable, to put it mildly. What it basically means is that we can be extremely confident that when we open the New Testament Gospels today, we have what was written. And footnotes in the best editions and in commentaries give us insights into the best attested variant readings where these occur in the surviving manuscript evidence. I would also argue that the outline of events they recount is broadly corroborated by other forms of evidence regarding religious beliefs, politics, and society. Furthermore, early written evidence from outside the Christian community, from Roman and Jewish sources, corroborate the fact that here was a revolutionary community making the most extraordinary claims, and ordinary people were having their lives transformed. Let me be frank about this. I cannot prove to you that the miraculous events described in the Gospels occurred. But what I can say is that those who wrote it down absolutely believed it had occurred as they recorded it. They absolutely believed they'd met a person unlike any other. They felt power and transformation in their lives that was astonishing. And large numbers of them were ready to die for these beliefs. That requires an explanation. And when you add to it the community which for 2,000 years has been making claims about the ongoing transformations made possible by Jesus and through believing in him, you begin to realise just how extraordinary this good news is. So there you have it. The gospel is the radical and outrageous message that God is supremely revealed in Jesus, who was crucified and raised to life, and that Jesus has made possible reconciliation with God and a transformed life lived in relationship with God. The Roman Emperor Augustus thought he was good news. Other emperors used the same language about themselves. They were wrong. The real good news is that a Jewish man in a corner of the empire who was horrifically executed by imperial authority is the answer to the deepest needs of the world. He was, in human form, the one through whom God made all that is. In him, the power of love is seen to be the most powerful force that exists and cannot be overcome. Now, that is what I call good news. And that's the gospel truth. It's the kind of thing one can really get evangelical about. The gospel is really important. It's what we are about.